The Engineer, a Chronicles of Actaeon story by Darran M. Handshaw. Narration by Justin Thomas James. '87 AR, the 47th day of arrival. Prologue. The Escape. The engineer eluded them for hours as he fled across the ruins, but in the end, they captured him. Surrounded, Actaeon knelt upon a large moss-covered tile and lowered his polished recurve bow gently to the ground before him. Then he raised his hands into the air in a gesture of surrender. "Gentlemen," he addressed them with cheerful confidence, "it appears we have a misunderstanding." Through the lenses of his goggles, Actaeon studied his three remaining pursuers as they closed in on him. The sunlight reflected off their clean-shaven pates, and their expressionless faces were each divided into 4 quadrants by a sharp black cross. They wore boiled leather armor and carried blades fashioned from sharpened shards of debris. One carried a short bow. All of them ignored his friendly greeting. "If there is something that you wish to discuss, a proposal, perhaps, I'd be more than willing to—" Actaeon's words were cut off abruptly as one of the cross-faced raiders lowered his bow and kicked him in the stomach, causing him to double over onto his side. The recurve bow he had set on the ground so carefully was kicked unceremoniously aside to be collected by another raider. The same raider also took the time to work Actaeon's halberd free from the body of one of their less fortunate comrades. "Careful with that bow, it's not designed for such abuse," Actaeon said, earning himself another kick that knocked the wind from him. He grimaced and rolled onto his back, where he could gaze up at the raider who had kicked him. He was rewarded with a face full of sunlight instead, and pulled his goggles down over his eyes to block some of the rays. Just as the engineer had begun to catch his breath, he was hauled to his feet by the raider that kicked him. Actaeon took the opportunity to study his captor's face for any insight. He found there only dull eyes, devoid of all emotion. Without words, the raider pointed north, where the ruins stretched out to disappear over the horizon in a turbulent mess of shattered structures and overgrown debris fields. "You must mean to communicate your desire for me to walk in that direction," Actaeon responded, as though it were up for discussion. "You would, of course, be welcome to join me heading south towards Pyramid. That is, if you would be willing to reconsider." He was rewarded with a smack to the back of his head. Actaeon grinned at the raider behind him. "I will take that as the implied negative that it would appear to be." He led the way along then, and the 3 silent raiders followed him closely, letting him choose the path northward. For hours they wound through the treacherous ruins of the northern boneyards, not pausing for rest. Their path took them past ancient flickering luminaries and conduits, arcing dangerously with blue tendrils of lightning. They climbed over mountains of scree and archaic rubble, up slides of debris from old collapsed structures, and through the framework of buildings that had fallen to pieces long before any of the current inhabitants of the city had arrived. Thorny bushes poked through the wreckage, and flowering creepers wound their way through ancient structural supports and tangled wires, soaking up every available inch of sunlight-soaked real estate to feed persistent roots in soil far below the degraded remains of a society lost. Nobody knew what had happened to the civilization that once had flourished there. When people arrived in the ruined city that had eventually come to be known as their redemption, there was no sign of those that had lived there before. Nothing but ghosts and discarded remnants of technology, dangerous and unknown. All had disappeared suddenly, leaving their once great city to fall to ruin. Actaeon had his theories about what happened. The ancients had left behind evidence aplenty to help answer the great unknown mystery of redemption. It was one of the reasons that, for the second time in his 25 years, Actaeon had left the safety of his home in southern Redemption, a hold in Rydell known as Shore, to explore the ruins of the city. The other reason was the fact that nothing else remained there for him. The young engineer was 19 when he returned home after his first 3-year excursion into the ruins of Redemption, only to find that his father had been killed in battle and his mother was deathly ill. He'd studied with every anatomist and herbalist he could find, looking for a cure to her ailment, a disease called rogue's bane, where the joints would swell and cause tremendous pain. Every case that he had researched, he found the same outcome. The lungs would slowly fill with fluid, and within a season or two, the victim would essentially drown. Actaeon had even gone to the gates of travail after hearing from one healer that they had seen a man be cured by the lore-sworn there. Despite his heartfelt request for the knowledge to save his mother's life, they had turned him away. As a child, he had thought to join the ranks of the lore-sworn one day, to study the relics of the ancients and unlock the keys to their technology with them. But the lore-sworn kept such artifacts and the knowledge they gleaned from them to themselves, with the declared purpose of preventing another cataclysmic event like the one that had been the downfall of the city. They were protecting people, they said. It was the opposite of everything that Actaeon believed. Given the chance, he'd share the truth of that knowledge with the world for the betterment of all. His mother fought a long battle with the rogue's bane at Actaeon's behest to give him time to search for a cure, but she eventually succumbed to the illness, leaving Actaeon alone and heartbroken. He gave up his studies of healing and started a metal casting business, having learned that he could cast many different parts of varying shapes and complexities out of dyes made from a refined clay. He took orders from across shore and even traveled as far as Lakehold on occasion to make some part or another for a lord or lady of the Raydell Dominion. The metalwork occupied him for several years. It wasn't enough for him, though. It didn't answer any of the big questions. Once he'd earned enough money to fund another expedition, he ventured out into the ruins of Redemption again. This time, his ultimate destination was the Pyramid of the Sun. There he would make sure his plans came together. One of the raiders gave Actaeon a shove, interrupting his thoughts. By Actaeon's reckoning, they were headed northwest towards Craters, a region in the Chiarine Dominion. He frowned at the thought. The people there liked to solve problems and disputes and all matters political with the edge of a sword or the strike of a fist, not a technique of which he was fond. The Chiarine Dominion was also the one dominion that permitted slavery. Actaeon had heard stories of the slavers that would wander the unclaimed regions of Redemption, looking for people to capture and sell to the Chiarnians. He wondered if these cross-faced raiders were slavers. That would explain why they went to such extremes to capture him alive instead of killing him. Still, they had lost one of their men during the process, and that just didn't seem worth the capture of a single slave. No, these men were after something different. The moment came nearly 5 hours into the trek. The raiders were getting tired. Actaeon heard them stumble several times on the debris as they followed his carefully selected path towards Craters. When he came out of the winding path between two foundation walls, he spotted exactly what he had been looking for. Before them, a rubble pile sloped upwards at a dramatic angle in every direction. To the left and right, the ascent looked feasible, but straight ahead was one of those areas he'd learnt about the difficult way. The incline ramped up at a steep, unstable angle. The engineer started up in that direction, and the raiders followed him, unaware. In the next moments, he thought, the precision of his actions would determine whether he lived or died. Actaeon set a strong pace for the climb, hoping to push the raiders to the limit. As he neared the top, he spotted what he had seen earlier, a large bar protruding from the side of the rubble pile. He paused and looked down at the raiders below. They were breathing hard and struggled to catch up with him. They had yet to realize their mistake. Once he reached the bar, he placed his scuffed leather boot at the exposed end of the bar and stepped up onto it, throwing his full weight behind it. Just as he had hoped, the bar acted like a lever and shifted. Below him, he heard rubble breaking loose from the steep incline. He gave the lever one final shove before he leapt clear of the debris slide he had started. He scrambled to pull himself up the rest of the pile towards the summit, as the ruin fragments below destabilized rapidly in a roaring tumult and a cloud of dust. He heard their cries of alarm and warning, and grinned at the thought that this is what it took to get them to finally speak. The thought was interrupted rather suddenly, however, as the debris beneath him began to lose cohesion and slide down the pile as well. Actaeon's heart pounded hard in his chest as he scrambled upward desperately, while the ground came loose beneath him and threatened to catch him in the debris slide. With a great effort, he reached the top of the pile and rolled away until he began rolling down another slope. He stopped and scrambled back up to the summit to look down at his captors. The engineer surveyed the scene through the scratched lenses of his goggles. Once the dust settled, 2 of the raiders were nowhere to be found. The third, the one that had kicked him, struggled to pull free, his legs trapped beneath 2 large beams that had rolled down atop him. Actaeon pulled himself to his feet and maneuvered carefully down the incline towards the survivor. He had a few questions for his former captor. When the last cross-faced raider noticed the engineer's approach, his eyes went wide. He dug down into the rubble with both hands, shredding them on sharp fragments in the process as he searched for his weapon. Actaeon slowed as he grew closer to the trapped raider, prepared for a confrontation. The raider withdrew his hands, and as Actaeon had anticipated, held up a dagger. However, the engineer did not expect the man's next move, and with one swift motion the raider drew the dagger across his throat to spill thick crimson blood down his brown leather armor. In a moment, the raider was dead, and Actaeon sat down heavily, taking the entire scene in. Luck and a carefully calculated maneuver had saved his life today, but he was nowhere closer to an answer as to why these men were pursuing him. It was both fortunate and unfortunate at once, he thought. At the bottom of the incline, he spotted his halberd as its finely wrought curved blade reflected the growing moonlight. He scrambled down the rest of the way to retrieve it. An inspection of both ends found that the pointed wedge at the bottom of the reinforced shaft was intact, but there was a notch near the edge of the blade where it hooked back on itself. How unfortunate, he said aloud. That done, he set about the task of digging carefully to locate his recurve bow with the valuable spotting scope attached to its midsection. It took him the better part of the evening, but he managed to locate it buried beside one of the dead raiders as he worked under the bright moonlight. Everything was miraculously intact, and he unstrung the bow before he fastened it back into the special clasp on the left shoulder of his ribbed leather jacket. As an afterthought, he searched both of the dead raiders. There was nothing enlightening to be found on them, so the engineer turned and started his way back south across the unforgiving terrain of the boneyards, named for the gigantic struts of ancient structures that loomed like the bones of an enormous beast and cast long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. As the early morning sun cast its spectrum of color across the ruins, Actaeon summited one of the last debris piles. From there, he could see the sunlight gleam off of the reflective tip of the pyramid in the distance. An appropriate name, he thought, Pyramid of the Sun. Just a few more hours now. From his vantage point, he could make out the collapsed north face of the pyramid. The enormous building of the ancients was full of fissures and crevices on that side, likely the consequence of some manner of great cataclysm, thought the engineer, perhaps the same one that formed the wreckage he was standing atop. The fatigue finally found its way into his joints and bones, so he leaned on the halberd and lowered himself until he was seated on a smooth block of elderstone. He could rest here for just a short while now, with his goal in sight. Everything he had planned depended on whether he could convince the people there in that pyramid of his worth to them.